Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Spoken Greats podcast, where I will be continuing to take a look at some cognitive biases and what kind of lessons we can take from them. Today, I will be drinking the Thymiopolis Xinomavro 2021 from Nausa in Greek Macedonia. Please let me know what you will be drinking in the comments. Now, Greece is always an interesting one because maybe it's the cognitive ease bias in action, in your brain tends to take the path of least resistance. But whenever I try and look at Greece on a map and conceptualize where things are, I immediately get put off. I don't know if it's the fact that it's made up of thousands of different islands, because I like to consider myself quite good at geography. I can look at Russia and I'm happy where Vladivostok is or Novosibirsk. But yet somehow when it gets to Greece, adding in the factor of the sea, I have no clue where anything is. So I had to look up this a little bit beforehand. So Xinomavro is one of the popular red grape varieties grown in Greece. Apparently, Nausa has quite a similar terrain to the Barolo region in Italy, so quite steep hills. And the Xinomavro grape is quite often compared to the Nebbiolo, which is the grape that goes into Barolo. So it's apparently medium-bodied and quite acidic, and notes of red plum, cherry. So let's see if it holds up to that, shall we? Cheers. Now, there's definitely a hint of red plum in the smell. It's not overbearing, but as I look in the glass now, it's got a beautiful, almost purple tint to it. Yeah, I'm not so sure about cherry, but I'm definitely picking up on red plum. It's quite acidic. My mouth is filling up with saliva right now. Bloody hell. You can definitely feel the tannin. I think this is the first Greek red I've tried. It's not bad. I've not really looked at Greece much before. I think the only other Greek wine I had was Retsina, which is basically a wine that's been infused with pine. Tastes horrible. Don't recommend it. But yeah, I would definitely give a Xinomavro a go another time. So let's see what I've got written down here. Yes. What you see is all there is. There's a tendency these days to rely on data. Everything prides itself now on being data-driven. We follow the facts. The issue with being data-driven, first of all, is that all data is in the past. So you are basing your future decisions on what's happened in the past. The future isn't obliged to act how the past did. But also, another issue with relying on data is that you're making the assumption that you've picked the right data set. And another issue with relying on data is that you may fall into the trap of going with the first plausible explanation that you find for a certain result. So a very popular example of this is with mine casualties in the Vietnam War. And they looked at the data and tried to extrapolate some trends from it. They saw a notable increase at certain times of the year. And then they deducted that this must be due to the agricultural season, when many members of the Viet Cong would return to the rice fields, and instead of fighting, they would be farming. And you think, wow, that seems quite plausible. As you can see, there's decrease in mine casualties during this period. What that failed to factor in was the tempo of US forces operations. And when you then laid that data set over casualties, you saw there was a direct correlation between mine casualties and US operations, because on operations there's more troops out on the ground, and so the probability of encountering a mine is a lot more likely because your data set is much larger. Another interesting one I always just think about is the UK is famous for having afternoon tea, for taking tea and some light sandwiches at 5 o'clock. Yeah, I challenge you to find any coffee shop or tea room that is still open at 5 o'clock. There's not many places you can get a coffee after that time. And yet our entire culture is built around this stereotype of afternoon tea. I think someone has looked at the stats of a coffee shop and seen that, oh, well, between the hours of 4 and 5 is actually when we sell the least amount of coffee. And so there's no point staying open any longer than that. But I would argue that's a case of what you see is all there is. Because in most coffee shops, the employees aren't paid any longer after the coffee shop closes. And so there's the incentive is for them to close down as quickly as possible. So start packing away the sandwiches, closing off areas, put chairs on tables, start cleaning the espresso machine. So no one wants to come into a coffee shop, sit down and get their laptop out and enjoy a coffee when all the tables next to them have the chairs up on them and someone's mopping by their feet. It's an ever so slight hint to fuck off. So people don't go. And so if you're only looking at that data set, you would see that there may be other reasons at play as to why people aren't ordering a coffee at that time. Similarly, if you want to go out in the evening to a show, let's say you want to go to the theatre or you want to go to a comedy gig or the cinema, the only options you either have dinner at an obnoxiously early time at 5 o'clock or a kebab. And there really is no in between, because by the time you get out of a show, it's getting on for best part of 9:30, 10 o'clock, and all the restaurants have already stopped serving. You could say that's something to do with licensing laws again, but they've probably looked at their sales data and determined that no one's having dinner at this time. But perhaps the reason they're not having dinner at this time is because they don't have the option to. By the time they get to the place, it's closing up and they don't want to be intruding. And so this is a key part of how what you see is all there is can play out. So let's talk about English sparkling wine. England, in fact, produces some of the world's best sparkling wine. It is competitive against some of the best champagne houses. And as the climate's changing in the southeast of England, the conditions are getting much more favourable to grow wine in the UK than in Champagne region, for example. And many brands such as Nine Tim, Capel Down, Ridgeview, etc., they've reported record profits in recent years. It's not been to a dramatic increase in quality. The wines have already been pretty good for quite a while. They've also not really increased their sales. In fact, alcohol consumption in general is trending downwards. They've actually increased their prices, which, if you were looking at it from a purely economic, rational, data-driven basis, you'd logically come to the conclusion that if the quality hasn't really improved that much, people are drinking less wine and the price has gone up, you'd deduct that their profits will have probably decreased. But that's the opposite of what's happened. Their profits are record high. Now, some of the explanation behind this may be due to a perception in quality. If you're going to compete with champagne, you need to understand why people drink champagne in the first place, because it's not purely for the quality of the wine. Champagne is not a logical purchase. You can get many fantastic cremons or South African sparklings which taste exactly like champagne for a fraction of the price. But people don't buy champagne for its merits as a wine. Maybe some people do. But the reason people buy champagne is precisely because it's expensive. There's the idea that you have gone to some expense on buying this expensive bottle of wine to mark a special occasion. So it marks on you and how generous you are as a host or as a friend. And so it's sending a signal. So when you try and tell people that English sparkling wine is just as good as champagne, the immediate response will be, well, if it's just as good as champagne, why doesn't it cost as much? And it's very hard to convince someone that the offer isn't too good to be true. people are naturally suspicious of getting something better for less. And so actually increasing the price of English sparkling wine so they cost about the same as a champagne likely helped the sale of English sparklings because it gave that same norm of it being expensive. And then suddenly, when you buy someone a bottle of Chapel Down, it doesn't seem like you're being a cheapskate when celebrating an occasion, but rather you're fulfilling some of that ulterior motive behind buying champagne. So let's talk about the anchoring effect. Assuming you don't know much about the history of India, if I were to ask you how old Gandhi was when he died, how many years less than 100 would you say? Now, I've given you a second to guess there, and the chances are that you were encouraged to guess a much higher number than his actual death. He died at the age of 78. By introducing a larger number there, it's a point of reference from which to make your estimates. And this is incredibly powerful in human psychology. Often the first stimulus or the first piece of information that is presented to us is given overwhelming weighting over the rest of the information. Now, the result of this is that if you're going to in negotiations, it's actually more of an advantage to be the first one to pick a number, because whatever number you pick, however ludicrously high it may be, if you're negotiating a salary or you're trying to sell something, what you will find is people will then start negotiating around that number. This is why houses have an asking price, because people will then negotiate according to the initial price. So whether they offered low, it has to be relative to the original anchoring point. A very common strategy in retail is good, better, best. So you have a product that is a bit more expensive than that, and then you had the most expensive product. Which one do you think sells the most? Usually it's the middle price one, because this is the Goldilocks effect. One's too expensive, one's too cheap, and the one in the middle is just right. So let's say you had 3 bottles of wine. One is £8, another is £15, and another is £65. You may think the £15 bottle near twice the price of the £8 bottle will seem quite unreasonable until you introduce the anchor point of the £65 bottle of wine, at which point it now seems perfectly reasonable price to pay. Many charity appeals have found when they ask for a donation and they name a specific amount, they find that their average donation is much closer to that stated number than if they were just to ask for an open-ended donation. Even if the number was considerably high, like £60 donation, people would see it as a benchmark and a point of reference to move towards. This is something that Rolls-Royce has figured out, because Rolls-Royce do not advertise at car exhibitions. If they were to do so, they would be at the high end. They would be one of the most expensive items at a car show. What Rolls-Royce figured out was that it was actually much more beneficial to advertise their car at private jet exhibitions. And this is because when you've been looking at a G5 and the figure in your head of spending has been $35 million, £300,000 on a car suddenly feels like an impulse buy. It's just like you're grabbing a sandwich at the supermarket. Whereas if you'd been looking at cars valued between 80 and 100 grand, 300 grand would suddenly feel like quite a significant purchase. Let's talk about availability bias. So availability bias is where someone gives more weighting to something which is easy for them to retrieve from their mind. For example, if I were to ask someone what are the odds of a terrorist attack happening, if you were to ask them that question in the aftermath several days after a terrorist attack, they're much more likely to overestimate the probability of it happening, because they are able to easily think of a scenario where that has happened. Interestingly though, If you ask that same person to extract 12 examples of terrorist attacks on the UK or 20, and then ask them what is the probability of a terrorist attack happening, they're actually much more likely to rate the probability as lower. Now, why is this the case? It's paradoxically providing more information convinces the person less. And it's not because of the quantity of the information, but because of the strain at which they've had to give that number of examples. Because anyone can name one terrorist attack. They'll say the 7/7 bombings in London, easy. Maybe you can give two more examples. You'll say the Manchester Arena bombings, and you'll say the Westminster Bridge attack. But suddenly you have to name 12 or 15. There's a bit of a pause there. Your brain's not operating as fluently. And because of that strain in trying to identify that number of incidents, it actually convinces you that it's less common because you're having to strain to think of an example. So in Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman talks about a study where they asked people to name some examples of when they were assertive and then asked them how assertive they are. Now, versus the blind study, when they just asked people how assertive they were, people who were asked to provide examples reported that they were more assertive. That's availability bias in action, because they've automatically been framed towards thinking of times when they were assertive. But then once you expand that number and ask them to name 12 times where they were assertive, maybe they'll get to the first 6, and then they struggle to find more examples. And in that group, they actually self-reported much lower level of assertiveness, even though they'd come up with more examples of when they were assertive. So it's kind of an example in action of where less is actually more. Often how easy we can come up with an example will relate to the media we're consuming. So if we're regularly seeing plane crashes occurring in the news, then our perception of how common a plane is to crash may be distorted as to the actual figure. We are, of course, far more likely to die in the car journey on the way to the airport than we are on an actual flight. But that does not change our perception because we are constantly exposed to examples of a plane crash. And that makes sense because a plane crash is noteworthy. That's why it's news, because it's not normal. But our brain does not account for that. A subset of availability bias is survivorship bias. So when they were looking at bomber planes which returned from raids on Nazi Germany during the Second World War, they examined the planes and looked at which parts of the plane endured the most strikes from anti-aircraft fire. So they looked over the parts of the plane and they concluded that the wings seem to take a lot of damage, so they need more armor. Now, an issue there with being data-driven is that there's a missing data set, isn't there? Because what about the planes that didn't come back? Because the problem here in looking at where the planes got hit that came back is it shows that the plane can be hit in those places and still safely return. What they initially failed to consider is where the plane cannot be hit and safely return. And so the planes that were safely coming back had not been hit in the engine. And so fortifying the engine would actually increase the survival rate of the bombers. This is a thing all the time when people study successful people and they look at their routines. They try and extrapolate some kind of lesson from it, and they will deduct that it must be the morning routines of these successful people. They wake up early in the morning and that's what makes them successful. But it fails to take into account that many people wake up early in the morning, such as shift workers or newborn parents, and they are not millionaires. So there's a missing data set which is going on there. Because of the tendency to find the most plausible answer, we have a tendency to pick that as the explanation. Being able to conceptualize an example will also warp the person's perspective on something. a common thing I've found when selling wine is, for example, for events like weddings, people will overestimate the amount of wine that they need to buy for an event because their biggest fear is that they will run out of wine. And everyone will talk about how inadequate of a host they were because they weren't able to provide their guests with sufficient alcohol. Now, the flaw in this thinking is because when they're looking at to how much wine to buy, they conceptualize who are the biggest drinkers I know. So they think to my rugby mates, they think of my alcoholic uncle, but extrapolated across the whole group, it's not a representative sample. And even factoring in a few overachievers who may consume a whole bottle of wine to themselves, they overcompensate and buy far more wine than needed and end up not drinking 2/3 of it. Because for every drunk uncle you have at a party, you have a grandma, you have someone who's gone teetotal, you have children, you have a good portion of people who will be driving. And so once you factor all of those people in, the amount of alcohol you actually need to buy for the event is much lower. But the example, which was so easy to find, of who do you know that drinks a lot, influences your decision to buy a lot of wine for the event. Just one last one on the availability bias, which is an interesting one. We overestimate the importance of what is visible. You can see this in a debate with immigration. Now, I'm not going to draw a line one way or the other on this. It's not a political podcast. But you often see, for example, in the UK, there's debates about stopping the crossing of boats in the English Channel. And you see in the United States, the whole debate over the US-Mexico border. Now, actually, in terms of immigrations, in both of those cases for legal immigration, people who fly into the country and then overstay their visas is a much larger percentage of the people who are illegally in both of those countries respectively. But because that's not visible and it's not something that you can obviously point out to in the media, that doesn't draw the same amount of attention as someone jumping a fence or landing in a boat. It doesn't provoke the same emotive response. And so both sides of the political spectrum can become entrenched in an issue. And they're talking about a very minor part of the issue. But because it's visible, because it's something concrete you can point to, because it's available to you, it becomes the focal point for the discussion, because it seems like a concrete problem that can be fixed versus how do you stop people overstaying. That seems to be a much more complex problem, but would arguably have much more effect on the numbers of illegal immigration. So I wanted to finish up by talking about risk. Now, risk is an interesting one because we do not view gains and losses equally. We are much more sensitive to the potential loss of £10 than we are to the potential gain of £10. When presented with two bets, let's say someone was offered the chance to either gain $50 or 100%, they can just have it, or they can flip a coin. And if it lands on heads, they get $100. If it lands on tails, they get nothing. Most people would logically take the 50 because the certainty of getting the $50 is valued at more than the possibility of gaining $100 versus gaining nothing. However, when you reverse this and ask people, would they rather pay $50, 100% they're going to pay it, or flip a coin and potentially pay nothing, or potentially pay $100. The majority swung in favour of taking the bet. We're actually much more geared towards taking a risk when we are faced with two bad options. It's like doing a Hail Mary in American football. If you're not aware of that, it's when the clock's at 0 and you throw the ball to the opposite end of the field in the hopes that someone can make a desperate attempt to score. Faced with the certainty of a loss, you might as well take a bet on winning. So sticking with the theme that people are more sensitive to loss aversion, and so we're much more attracted to the certainty of not having a negative experience than we are to the possibility of having a positive experience. It's very difficult on eBay, for example, to sell an item if your seller rating isn't 100%. Even if it's as high as 96% and you're selling the item a lot cheaper, many people will just not take the risk because you don't have a perfect track record. This is the same thing in the case of McDonald's. For all of McDonald's sins, it's consistent. And many people criticize tourists when they're abroad. You've traveled all the way around the world. Why have you gone to McDonald's? Well, if you've just arrived in a place and you don't know where to go, in McDonald's, there will be toilets, there's Wi-Fi, you can charge your phone in there, and you know what you're going to expect from the food. It's not going to give you diarrhea. You also know you're not going to be ripped off for being a foreigner. And so it's not that you're seeking out an excellent experience. It's that you're trying to avoid an overly negative experience. This is a contention of mine, which I've struggled to understand in selling wine, is that some of the best-selling wines taste like shit. But the best-selling wines really are cheap, mass-produced, and have no interesting character to them. This is where they've tried to replicate the soft drink industry. They've tried to make the wine, this like Yellowtail or 19 Crimes. They've tried to produce a wine like Coca-Cola. They've tried to make a brand that's consistent, so people know what they're getting every time they open the bottle. Now, personally, I think this takes the fun out of wine and out of the nuances, but for a lot of people, they're so afraid of opening a bottle of wine and not liking it that they go with the same thing every time, because it's not that they're seeking out an amazing wine, it's they've found something that's vaguely drinkable and they don't want a bad experience. And this is even when most wine shops now offer a guarantee where if you don't like the wine, they'll refund it to you. So you literally have nothing to lose from trying a new one. But it's very difficult to overrule that natural tendency to avoid unpleasant experiences. Okay, I think we'll leave that there for today. Thank you for listening to the Spoken Greats podcast again. If you enjoyed the show, please hit the subscribe button. We'll be back soon with more great ideas from great books. See you soon.